As Jeff said, the title or subject matter of this section is Federal Solutions to the Crisis of Democracy in America. And it is a crisis. A lot of us who are in the know, if we weren't aware that it was a crisis before, Citizens United was a bellwether that, let us know that something's going wrong. And if Citizens United wasn't loud enough for most people, the recent decision in the McCutcheon versus FEC case is an even louder alarm. But those two instances aside, even if we were still complacent and we thought somehow these were just two bad decisions by a rogue Supreme Court, the recent study by Princeton University, which said scientifically that the US is in fact not a democracy, but an oligarchy, should have got our gears turning a little more. But you don't need to look at these numbers or the expertise to know that we live in a new Gilded Age, where the robber barons have been replaced by the Koch brothers and the Walton family, and the railroad companies have been replaced by large energy producers and Wall Street bankers. Amending the Constitution is the only way that we can address all of the various issues that currently plague our democracy in a real systematic way. On February 14, 2003, Move to Amend's We the People Amendment was introduced in Congress, and we picked up a few more sponsors in the last few weeks. But that's not what I intend to talk about in this short few minutes. I will take a short second to say, for those who say that we must construct campaign finance or open election laws instead of amending the Constitution, I say that those are noble pursuits and they're reasonable aims, but the Citizens United ruling itself and its subsequent effects make any substantive positive effects that these type of acts could produce moot. For evidence of this, we need look no further than the case of McComish versus Bennett in 2001, a little over 1 year after the Citizens United ruling. In another fair and balanced ruling, the Supreme Court held that Arizona's matching funds scheme, which provides additional funds to a publicly funded candidate when expenditures by a privately funded candidate and independent groups exceed the funding initially allotted to the publicly financed candidate, substantially burdens political speech and is not sufficiently justified by a compelling interest to survive First Amendment scrutiny. Basically what this ruling said is if you're a candidate and you're running under Arizona's public financing laws, which basically allow you to get matching funds if a privately funded candidate or a super PAC spends more money, you cannot get that extra money, because you getting that extra money, even though it can be construed as being in the public interest, is a violation of the richer person's or the richer candidate's speech. And that richer person's speech is more important than yours. The court also, shortly thereafter, the court also refused to hear a case about a Montana fair elections law that had been on the books for over 100 years before being invalidated by Citizens United. Though the court may oscillate to some degree on social issues, it has always historically protected. Any new laws put on the books would also be subject to this same type of judicially biased scrutiny. In order for those laws to survive, they must be underpinned by a constitutional support in the form of an amendment. We must not wait for the federal government to act. We must compel them to act. We must make ourselves impossible to ignore. What we really need is a democracy movement and not just to amend the Constitution. Now, the abolitionists worked for decades, some since nearly the inception of the institution of slavery, with success not culminating until the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments were passed in the mid-1800s. We can thank the organizing of women's suffragists at Seneca Falls in 1848 for the 19th Amendment, which did not happen until 72 years later in 1920. It was the social justice and anti-war movements in the 1960s that produced the 26th Amendment that gave young Americans who were old enough to die in Vietnam the right to vote in elections for the first time. And although it is not an amendment, it was the long, hard work of decades of civil rights organizers and activists, and not the enlightened benevolence of Lyndon Baines Johnson, that produced the piece of hallmark legislation that for the first time recognized the systematic inequalities in place in the American system of government, the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Now, I don't mean to mischaracterize the ardent struggles of these past attempts to amend the Constitution or pass landmark legislation. But unlike those past efforts, we don't have the luxury of time to complete our task. Every moment we waste ensures the further destruction of our planet's ecosystem, the poisoning of our air and water, the weakening of our ability to organize into unions, the further stripping of our rights to privacy, and the cableization of our internet. But how do you ignite a movement? OWS camped in the park. Rosa Parks sat on a bus. Lucky for us, we're still riding the first wave of a true democracy movement in the United States, but we must do more to push our movement further along the path towards success. At Move to Amend, we think that there's a lot to learn from the success of past movements that have resulted in amendments to the Constitution or landmark legislation. We're currently in month 7 of an internal education project designed to learn collectively with our affiliates across the country about what succeeded and what failed in past campaigns to amend the Constitution. In addition, we're constantly seeking new sponsors for our We the People amendment. Also, this year we're working with the U.S. Social Forum and its numerous associated community organizing groups to organize people's movement assemblies across the country so people can gather together and learn the detrimental effects of unchecked corporate power with the people in their own community and craft local strategies to resist. The documentary, Legalized Democracy, which you can watch on our YouTube channel for free, sums up the issue that we are facing and the history behind it. It is a useful way to educate the uninitiated. Lastly, and we haven't really advertised this much, though to some degree we're working with Public Citizen on this. Looking forward to the next presidential election, we're organizing a campaign to get all of the candidates that participate in the Republican and Democratic primaries on record as to whether or not they support an amendment to the Constitution that says corporations are not people and money is not free speech. This and a number of different ways are just the way that we think we can put pressure on the federal government, because I feel like a lot of us have already said it in a few different ways. We can't rely on the federal government. We can't rely on the current Congress. We probably can't rely on the next 2 to 3 Congresses. So what we can do is build a movement and build pressure so that by the time, so that once we have a critical mass, we will be unable to ignore. So our federal strategy should be not to ask the federal government, but to force the federal government.